All right, if I can have your attention. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Glen Doran. Glen and I, well, I had the, I'm not sure.
Be careful.
I know, I promise not to tell any stories. But I had the opportunity to work with Glen for 35 years, basically. And during that time, the Windover project was done. And it was really a heady time, a very interesting time. And I think you'll enjoy this. So please welcome my colleague, Glen Doran.
Well, this really is how it started. We got a phone call one afternoon. I was actually doing some field work in Pensacola, and the guy said, actually one of the people out of the vice president's office at FSU said, we've got a guy on the phone who wants to talk to somebody who knows something about skeletal material, and we think that's you. And I said, okay, and we went and talked to him, and we ultimately, one of the grad students and I came down to Brevard County, which I didn't know where Brevard County was. I'd only been in Florida for about 2 years. So I had to get the map out, and anyway. This is what we saw. Not exactly the most interesting possibility you can imagine. 2 spoil banks ran about 70 feet, peat, and this nasty little pond. But this is what really got our attention. And the landowner, Jim Swan, was part of EKS. He's Jack Eckerd's stepson. And if he had not had the interest, he never would have called us. And we never would have seen this site. This is what attracted our attention. I had done a lot of skeletal material in Texas and California. I know what good preservation is like. This is almost as good as biological supply house material. And it was real obvious that the potential was truly phenomenal. We picked up a number of individuals, and about 4 of them were subadults, less than 12 years of age, and there were a couple of infants in there about 2 years of age, which I had also seen a lot of material in Texas and California. And kids are very, very scarce in the archaeological record for a whole host of reasons. Now, those of you who like lithics, this is it. Nothing else. These are the only absolutely non-perishable artifacts from the Windover site down in Brevard County. And I think Sam identified these all as Panosofsky Quarry Cluster. I don't know whether they were even making the distinction between east and west. And it's not terribly impressive, except they still have some of the mastic on the base of these things. So these were clearly hafted. And that really is it. But we were fortunate enough to work with Jim Swan, the landowners, and ultimately they were able to go to the state of Florida and got funding for us for 3 years worth of excavation and 1 year of lab work. We also had external funding from a variety of sources, but really we could not have done this had it not been for the local community and literally hundreds of volunteers who came out and helped us on a day-to-day basis for 3 years during the field work. We had one guy who tracked satellites for NASA during the night, and then he would come out to the site and work for 4 or 5 hours during the day, and then go home and start the whole thing over again. So we have, and many of us, would echo that we could not do what we have done and accomplish what we have accomplished without public support and an incredible bunch of really smart, dedicated volunteers. Now, I was raised in West Texas. I'd never seen a peat bog. I'd done a little bit of well pointing over in Pensacola, but we worked very closely with Pumping Manufacturing out of Orange Park, Florida, and they said, well, if we go around and we inject these well points in, we ought to be able to control the water. So we said, tell us what to do. And so we became pretty expert at well pointing and dropping these well points down. I was telling people at dinner a minute ago that we lost a couple of these. Now, these are 20-foot PVC, or not PVC, but galvanized pipe. And as you get it down in, you literally let it go. And several of them just disappeared. And somewhere in the aquifer in Brevard County, they're still rambling around down there. And I was actually afraid the Wellpoint Company would offer some of the crew more money than I could pay, but they all stuck with us from beginning to end. This is Tom Pender. Some of you know him. He's an archaeologist. He's at Patrick Air Force Base, and in a way we'll see him again later. So this really was a phenomenal, truly once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and situation where everything came together. Now, if you look at this, the normal water table would be up here at about shoulder level. So we've drained the water, we've taken off the top 4 or 5 feet of peat, and this is the layer in which the burials are coming out of. So this is a lot of overburden, basically sterile. I mean, it's got lots of environmental data, but maybe 1 or 2 pieces of pottery in the top part of it, and that's about it. And once you get below the burial level, virtually nothing in there. But again, we've got good environmental data back to about 11,000 BP. So we've got this beautiful sequence, uninterrupted sequence of environmental data. For me and the other osteologists that have been involved, we ultimately recovered 168 individuals. And not all of them are quite as well preserved as the crania you saw there, but it is a stellar collection for this time period. All the radiocarbon dates cluster around 7,200 years uncorrected. So we're talking about 8,500 years ago. And this was apparently a fairly consistent burial pattern we've seen at 4 or 5 other sites, only in Central and South Florida. Nowhere else in the continental US. I've heard one sort of report from Central America, but I've never seen anything in print about it. So this was the standard way of disposing, if you will, of your next of kin. With a large sample like that, it gives you incredible analytical power that you just can't get from 1 or 2 individuals. Now, I was actually born and raised in Midland, Texas, and there is a Midland man who's actually a Midland woman, and it's represented by a piece of the crania and a couple of finger bones. That's it. Now, I can tell you some things about that person, but not anywhere near when you have the information depth and detail of when you have a larger group of individuals like this. Now, if you look at the artifact inventory, clearly deer were right up on top of the list. Lots of deer bone, lots of antler, but that's not all that you get. And some of the deer bone materials are, in fact, in various stages of manufacture. This is one of those pieces of lithic material. I think this are probably weaving tools used to manufacture hand-woven fabric materials. And shark's tooth and dog teeth were important cutting items. We actually have more teeth than we do lithic material at Wendover. This is, there was a time when I was a little bit skeptical about deer tine projectile points. I have no skepticism anymore because we have one individual who's got one of these deeply buried in his rump. It's still in place when he was buried. We'll see him a little bit later. And that would hurt, but it wouldn't kill him. The other part of that story is he also appears to have been decapitated. So decapitation, mutilated, somebody brought him home and they were able to put him into, shall we say, the appropriate burial place. Dog ulna, deer ulna, bobcat, probably not mountain lion, but smaller, things like bobcat. And here is one of these still, fairly functional antler flakers in some cases, but clearly also projectile points. So there's a lot of sharp stuff that you could get out of some of these collections and not rely on lithic material solely. And here is that individual. Like I said, it would have been fatal, but it would have certainly hurt. And there's a couple of great historic illustrations of somebody being on the ground and somebody else with a spear basically stabbing them in the rump. And that's about what this angle would suggest, that the person was already on the ground, because you can't fall backwards on your own spear very well. It's just not doable. We also have a number of atlatl parts, as well as a couple of shaft fragments from atlatls. So no bow and arrow at this time. This was all, spear throwing and thrusting spears. Like I said, he was otherwise, except for the head and this injury, a pretty healthy individual, about 29 years of age. These would normally be described as atlatl handles or weights, and they may be, but notice almost all of them are also fragmented, shattered, and this one still has a little piece of dental material, probably dog bone, that's glued down in the non-business end of this thing. So these may have had multiple uses, not just as atlatl handles. And probably a big shaft straightener here to keep your spear and your shaft straight on a cold, sort of cold, wet morning in central Florida. Wood artifacts were not that uncommon. And everything that comes from a wet site, you have to think about conservation. You have to think about stabilization. This stuff has been, in this case, sitting in a peat soil, fairly neutral environment for about 8,000 years. If you let it dry out, it comes apart. And this piece is about the size of my thumb. And it literally came apart while we were taking the photograph. It was it's like balsa wood. It looks good, but you could pick it up and it was just very, very friable and simply didn't have any structural integrity, as they say. And sometimes you run into things in wet sites that you don't have a clue what they were used for. And this is a nice piece of oak. It's got this hole drilled here and one from the top. I have no clue. Several people have suggested maybe it was a net handle, and that's as good an interpretation as I can come up with, because we know they were harvesting fresh water, particularly freshwater resources, small game, deer, bobcat, and probably butchering dog as well. This is a pretty typical burial stake from Wendover. Some of these, you could clearly see them being driven down into the peat, and a couple of them are bent. They've contorted over time. Again, they look good, but there's no structural integrity to them. So you could take one up and just crush the whole thing in the palm of your hand. It would be like wet paper mache. So this issue with conservation is real critical. This is a National Geographic reconstruction, their version at second field season, I think. And if I was doing this again, I'd probably pull the water down, scrape some of the peat back, put the body below the peat level, put peat back on top, and then put these stakes on top of it. Bodies will bloat and float, and this would keep the bodies, in the bottom of the bog, so to speak. The other thing is some of the stakes that we can see, if you look at the top part of them, they're much more weathered. So I think some of these actually were probably sticking up above the pond itself, and you can think of this as, well, where do we bury Uncle John? Well, let's look where the stakes are, because we can tell that's burial, and then we can put the burial in adjacent to it without interrupting any of the previous burials. We also have, it's a little hard to tell, we also have the world's largest, I think the world's largest collection of alligator feces. I tried to get some of the folks at the University of Florida excited about this, and it was just falling on dead ears. But it's a great environmental nugget, so to speak. You can get parasites out of it. You can get pollen out of it, phytoliths, date it. It's really neat stuff. You have to have perhaps a different attitude. So here are some of these dog teeth, canine teeth, and they also have this mastic on them. So they were probably used on a short carving tool, let's say. And here are some of this is the entire collection of shark's teeth. You can get sharks in the Indian River. You can get them in the St. Johns River. And certainly after big storms, they will be beached from storm damage, and you can just pick them up off the shore of Cape Canaveral and some of these other places, the Mosquito Lagoon. There's no signature that they were harvesting a lot of material from saltwater. Turn around, look inland, and that's where it seems like most of the edibles and the material was coming from this, a really rich marsh environment. We had multiple thousands of visitors who came to the site, and somebody said, I can't imagine living here prehistorically. And for us, I thought, this is the best place in the world to be. You've got freshwater resources, you've got marsh resources, you've got terrestrial resources, and in this area, you could travel 7 or 8 kilometers and pick up virtually all the Central Florida environmental areas. So I think it would have been a great place to be. Now, this is a little bit like looking at clouds. One afternoon, one of our excavators who had been with us all 3 seasons came over and said, the peat is coming off of this surface in a peculiar way. She says, I think there's some sort of fabric material under here. What you can't see from the rest of this little photo blog was cloth, question mark. Wasn't convinced, wanted to see it. Now are you convinced? It was finally teased out, and there was no question. We have multiple samples of what's called three-strand twining. It doesn't appear in the modern context of the last couple of thousand years. It seems to be one of the older twining cloth manufacturing techniques in the New World. And I was talking to somebody the other day. I said, you know, if you look at Venus figurines, 20,000, 40,000, 50,000, a lot of them show what some have interpreted as tattoos on the arm and bands around the head. Those almost certainly are fabric materials, hand-woven fabrics of some sort. So fabric technology goes back, I'd say 50,000 years without any stretch. The question is, do you find it in the archaeological sites and in a context where you can date it? And that's the real problem. So this is a very special kind of situation where the preservation conditions were just right. We had a great local community to help us do the excavations, and we had pretty good funding. This is an expanse under basically the thorax area. This is an impression from a humerus. All these are individual rib impressions, and you can very clearly see the material here. Jim Ottavasio at Pittsburgh and Mercyhurst was responsible for the analysis of the fabric materials. And it's been kind of frustrating because part of the processing technique was to strip the outer cortex of the plant material off, probably with your mouth. We've got a lot of really worn teeth in this collection. So it's a mechanical stripping process. But the sort of the bast cells and fabric looks like it's either sable palm or saw palmetto. So if you go down the highway anywhere in Panhandle of Florida, Central Florida, it's like cotton fields if you know what to look for. You know, you could go out in an afternoon, come back with a couple of 100 pounds of sable palm or saw palmetto to process to make this string and twine, and then go and start doing the weaving techniques. This is another intact burial. This is a section of fiber material that was preserved on top, and there's a couple of other pieces up here. And this is a subadult. You can tell by some of the growth plates that are still very active in this burial. And most of the burials were flexed. Not all of them were. Most of them, not all of them, were on the right side and heads toward, I hate to do it this way, heads toward Disneyland or Disney World, toward Orlando. This is one of the corners of one of these pieces of hand-woven fabric material. This is about like a horse blanket, to give you a modern analogy. There's also some material that has 10 strands of thread per centimeter. That's about the same as a modern t-shirt crew top. Very finely made. I mean, this was not a new technique. They undoubtedly came into the New World having a full array of fiber technologies that we simply don't see. And you'll still see an awful lot of publications where the clear impression is these folks are, wearing hides and furs. That may have been, but this is probably what you wanted in a wet, damp environment down here, something that would dry out fairly quick. Where's our gourd guy? I don't think, there he is. Do you recognize it? There's Lagenaria ciceraria, white-flowered bottle gourd. It appears by 15,000 BP pretty much all over the world. I can't track it into Australia. Heartland is South Africa. It could have floated, but everywhere you've got people at 15 and 20,000 years ago, I think you also had bottle gourd because it's a wonderful container. It's not really edible. It's got all these bitter compounds in it. There's perhaps an argument that some of the Asian bottle gourds are edible. I've seen them pickled in grocery stores in Japan, you know, pickled bottle gourd. They pickle everything in Japan. So apparently they were doing some pickling. This is recent too. But these things were probably the earliest domesticate in the world, except for the dog. And they don't grow by themselves. You leave them out. I've grown them in the front yard, and they last about a season or two, and then nothing else comes up. So I think there has to be hot, sweaty little human hands involved in the propagation, maintenance, and care of stands of bottle gourd. Now that doesn't quite fit your simple model of hunter-gatherers who moved around a lot. These people were sort of oscillating, I think, within the Brevard, Volusia, Orange County area on a fairly consistent basis. 91 individuals also had preserved brain masses. We initially hooked up with some geneticists at the University of Florida, and they could say, yes, it is in fact human DNA, but we have continued, other researchers have continued over the last now 30 years, and the DNA is just not terribly well preserved. It keeps coming back saying, yeah, it's DNA, but we really can't get any information out of it. Bone is great, fiber material's great, wood's great, but the DNA is damaged by whatever environmental conditions were preserving all that. Just played holy hell with the DNA. Osteologists are basically storytellers. We can tell you a lot about individual health, population health, accidents, and injury. This is a blowout fracture. Somebody got a fist to the eye, and it literally blew out the back of the orbit, which is real thin, almost parchment-like bone back there. And it probably trapped the eye muscles. So this guy, when he was looking out there, he probably would have seen 2 deer or 2 rabbits because they weren't tracking together. This is becoming, with advanced age, some of you are experiencing some of these vertebral problems, these little osteoarthritis here. This guy would have gotten up a lot slower on a chilly morning because there's a lot of vertebral damage to some of these older individuals. There's this, I'd call it a crude and inaccurate model that most everybody was dead by 60, 65 years of age. We've got a couple of particularly little old ladies who probably will make it into the upper 70s. And they show lots of wear and tear on the skeletal system. I mean, I think all of you would remember who Tiny Tim is. He said, "You are what you eat." Well, what you eat and what you do shows up in skeletal analysis as well. This is a young, probably male, not too sure, with Spina Bifida. It is still a problem with it's a developmental issue, and it frequently leads to an early death by the mid-teens or so. But this is an individual who was cared for very effectively. This is that individual's tibia. There was no foot on here. This is a massive osteolytic infection, probably not able to get around on their own. Somebody else was, whenever they moved, they were moving him or her along with them. It's not as good a preservation of the intact skeletal material, and it's a young individual, so it's a little bit touch and go on whether that's male or female. So that's not bad if you have this kind of profound health problem and people are taking care of you pretty darn effectively. Any dentists in here? Now, how would you like to have that massive molar abscess in here? Lost a couple of teeth. This became a systemic infection, and this is probably what killed this individual. If you have a dental problem, go to the dentist, because infections and abscesses are a very surprisingly frequent cause of death. It leads to myocardial infarctions, and once it becomes a systemic infection, you're pretty much going to check out unless you get antibiotics. And that's clearly not what happened here. This is a little less of a major abscess over here, but you can see, apical abscess. So dental problems are pretty interesting in some of these populations as well. This is a youngish person, not too much wear. Somewhere where I am, people were doing a lot of things with their teeth. There was a lot of destruction, a lot of damage, probably processing fibers, and it was pretty heavy-duty wear and tear on your mouth. We also have a number of very peculiar dental anomalies of cusp morphology, which I won't go into, but we have a higher incidence of some of these peculiarities in this population and another population from central Texas that's about the same age. It's a very early marker, shall we say. If you have multiple children fairly frequently, it's not uncommon in the old days for your great-grandmother or somebody said, you'll lose a teeth for every child you bear. That infant in the womb is basically a parasite. It's going to take over your metabolism, and it's going to harvest the calcium out of your bones to feed itself and to build bone material. It literally is like a short circuit that says, okay, I'm demanding the calcium because I need it to grow, and I'm taking it from you. So this is the sort of thing you would expect to see in somebody who is anemic and has this sort of a web-looking phenomenon up here in the orbits. So you can count those, more males, more females. What age do you see the worst problem? As I said, I'm probably the luckiest archaeologist you'll see, and part of that luck is having been able to work with researchers literally all over the country, doing specialized analysis. Some of it's in the field, some of it's in the lab, sending samples off. So we've been incredibly, incredibly fortunate. Now, one of the things that Wendover allowed me to do is get into some other places in the country and in the world to see some other kinds of wet sites. Now, this is a photo Rochelle has not seen. I've had an experience with dugout canoes for a long time. This is coming out of Mexico back into Belize in a dugout. This is a Mexican Army soldier here who's paddling us across. I think it's the Rio Hondo. This was the normal mode of transportation down there. And dugouts are not old-fashioned, except they've been around for about 10,000 years, but they're still widely used around the world. They're very, very effective. And there's Judy Benz and Chuck, Chief. This is a dugout that somebody brought into FSU, and they're working on the preservation. Again, anything that comes out of these wet sites, you have to worry about stabilization, conservation, and ultimately curation. Otherwise, they look like this dugout over here. This is what happens. I've lost there it is. This is what happens because it looks good, but when it starts to dry, the long lignin fibers in the wood are in fact little tiny checky things, and they just completely, if you will, explode when it's completely dry. Florida has the largest collection of prehistoric dugouts in the entire world, period. We've got dugouts that go back over 6,000 years, and when we look at some of the osteoarthritic changes in the Wendover folks, a lot of it's in the shoulder and a lot of it's in the elbow. If I'm in a dugout, poling or paddling, throwing nets, that's where the stress is going to be. So it makes like I said, it makes a good story for what's going on. The problem with a lot of old boating technology is a lot of it is wood, bone, antler, and hide. This is a reconstruction of an umiak from up in the Aleutians. People are still using these things covered with walrus hide. You got to keep them wet. When it starts to fall apart, you can repair it. Some of these probably last for 100 years. And then when it gets too bad or you've got a new Evan root or whatever, it becomes part of the firewood chain and you use it for something else. And you could put probably about 15 or 20 people in here. There's some archaeologists who work for SEAC who worked up in the Aleutians, and this is the way they got to the job site. They would get into one of these big umiaks, take off, and 45 minutes later they'd drop them off on one of the Aleutian islands. Boats are often regarded as one of the most complex forms of technology in human history because there's a lot of planning, a lot of craftsmanship that goes into the production and use of these things. And California is particularly interesting. This is basically in the Santa Barbara area. The Chumash have these plank canoes that were very clearly documented in early Spanish period. And there's a lot of similarity between some of these canoes and some of the canoes you see out in the South Pacific that are still being used in contact period. And there's some interesting linguistic studies that point out some of the way the ties are, and some of the words for fish hook and paddle are very, very similar in the South Pacific and in some of these Chumash populations that we have linguistic data for. You know, I think lots of people, relatively speaking, were probably coming down that Pacific coast and all the way down to South America. Maybe never too far away from land. You could see it over there. But would I rather be walking, or would I rather take a boat? I'm raising my hand for the boat, and certainly in Florida. Torihama is a big shell midden in Japan, about the same time period, a little bit more recent than Wendover. And you've got multiple dugout canoes here, a little bit flatter than what we see. Paddles are, run amok. You see lots of canoe and paddle parts in Finland and some of the mud deposits up there. It is a worldwide technology, and the best guess right now is we got people into Australia 50,000 years ago, and there's no way to walk there. Had to have some sort of reasonable craft, maybe dugout, maybe rafts that get you into these places. And if you're standing there on the shore and you can see the birds disappear for a couple of days and they come back in a couple of days, there's something out there. And we kind of have a wanderlust. Now, I'm telling you, we still use dugouts around the world. Some of these things are massive and will carry tons of provisions, multiple people. There's some real well-documented historic accounts of Florida dugouts, particularly along the Atlantic, maybe the Gulf Coast more than the Atlantic. And some of these talk about carrying 25 and 30 people. I think the big issue is, how big is the tree, and can you turn it around in the rivers that you're working in? And clearly, the St. John's is a snap. Same thing with the Indian River. So I could see people going, one way on the St. John's and Indian River and coming down the Atlantic coast, or the Atlantic coast with no problem. Maybe not carrying 1,000 pounds of bananas, but you get the idea. The Irish have real good accounts of coracles, which are basically hide boats over frames. Plains Indians, there's accounts of them doing buffalo hides, a couple of hides on a wicker work to go across some of the rivers. And this is an early Chinese picture from probably about 1910. And you could get a horse in there if you wanted to. I'm not sure I'd want to be in there with the horse, but they will float and you can go. And I've told students in the past, I said, if you've ever camped by a river and you had a big wind come up and it blew your tent into the water, it'll float. And I'm sure that's the way people figured out some of these boating technologies, is just by observation of, shall we say, bad plans and accidents, and said, maybe we should do this intentionally, Let's get going. Depending on where you are, the materials will vary dramatically. There's a sort of a tourist industry down in Lake Titicaca where they have reconstructed some of the floating islands, reed houses, and this is a pretty good, fairly floatable boat. And certainly some of the ones are very similar to what Kon-Tiki was, coming from Hawaii, South America, back and forth. I don't have a big problem with making that transit. Now, out of 1,000 people who tried it, maybe only 15 or 20 made it. But, like I said, we have this bit of a wanderlust, I think. This is extremely simple. This is about 7 pieces of real big bamboo lashed together. And this is a platform from which they're doing anhinga fishing. Cormorants with a ring around their neck, throw them in the water, they come back with a fish. I take the fish out, throw the cormorant back, give him a little treat, and away we go. And this is still going on both in China and in Japan. Where you've got boats, where you've got water, whether it's fresh or salt doesn't make any difference, you're fishing. You're taking advantage of the resources that are there, and this is a wonderful static way of investing maybe give me 6 or 7 of you guys, gals. We can go out. We can put a little wicker work across the Aucilla River and sit around for a couple of days and wait and see what comes in. And if you're really clever, you can build a little box trap at the end. This is a historic, I think, Florida illustration, but it doesn't make any difference where it is. You got the dugout, you got the paddles, people are out here, you're harvesting fish. This is what that fish weir looks like after a few thousand years. There's one here, there's one here. This is on a back edge of the Puget Sound, dates to about 2,000 years ago. And when you look down that little slough, this is low tide, there's a dozen of them. I mean, they are everywhere. I have talked with a lot of Florida archaeologists, and I can only come up with about 5 fish weirs in the entire state. That's something we're missing. We're just not seeing them. We're not looking for them. We don't recognize them for what they are. And because they're in these river channels, they're going to get eroded, destroyed every big flood. Here's, again, that picture of what a fish weir looks like from on top. This is another one. This is in an airport construction in Japan, and you can see it running all the way around here. And it still has the ties on those withies as part of the construction process. Very easy to construct and extremely productive. There's a lot of places in California where they talk about you couldn't put your fish weirs up until about half the salmon run because the people in the Sierras are going to come down and be really upset when you're catching all the salmon. Not only on Andromeda's fish, but a lot of other kinds of fish that move in and out of these waterways. And you got lots of people out here at one time harvesting all this stuff. Baskets, paddles, and undoubtedly hooks. You have to look kind of closely at this. This is a little tiny vein quartz flake. And there was a discussion of these things in a lot of different places. And a lot of people come to the conclusion that they're too small to be tools. They're just flaking debris. They were going for something larger. This is a site up near Seattle on the west coast, Straits of San Juan de Fuca, called Hoko. And that's what it looks like when it's still on the original 7,000-year-old cedar twig with wrapping around it. It's embedded. And this is actually the size of blade that some of the ladies in the community still like to use to process salmon. Very small. It's sort of a prehistoric X-Acto knife. And deadly sharp. There are a few communities around the world that still use these fish weir systems. This is a traditional community in Japan. And only certain communities can do it because they're so effective. Fish and game would go nuts if we put weirs in some of the rivers in Florida, I guarantee you. But we could eat for weeks on what we could get out of there. And it's, again, once you build it, maintain it a little bit, it's a beautiful static system of producing a lot of protein. With some of these areas, you also get the same sort of thing from these sites where you find the leader and literally, you know, the intact hooks. These larger ones, bent wood hooks, are probably used, if I can get the story straight, for halibut, some of which would be 400 and 500 and 600 pounds, whereas these V-shaped hooks are probably for what they refer to as round fish, things like trout, salmon, dog salmon. So there's some surprisingly specific hook technologies for specific sets of fish. Who recognizes that, you Florida guys? Yeah, this is in the St. Johns River, upstream, and this is, I don't think this is quite 6 feet tall, but it's about, well, maybe pretty close to 6 feet, at Huntoon Island. Huntoon Island has an incredible wet inventory, and if you were paddling up or down the river, this is, you know, not a bad argument for a boundary marker. You know, this is where a big village is. This is where a bunch of people are. So if I'm trying to get by, I'm going to go to the far side of the river and paddle like hell. Key Marco, one of the most spectacular sites ever excavated in Florida. A lot of people have never heard of it. They haven't seen the materials that are at Gainesville or in some of the publications. You know, polychrome painted shingles, deer, multi-component deer parts, atlatl parts, alligator, and all sorts of things represented. This is not special in Key Marco. Probably everybody in Florida had the equivalent of this. If you look at wet sites around the world, most people would tell you somewhere between 80 and 95% of the stuff traditional populations have is made of bone, antler, wood, fiber, feather, leather. It's not the lithics. That was a tiny inventory of non-perishable material. It's the organic stuff that allowed people to survive. And really quite sophisticated stuff. This is Salt Springs not too many years ago. Chris Leidick, and there's Jim Dunbar. Bottle gourd and cucurbit seeds by the thousand. This was all over the place. We just don't see it in typical dry settings unless it's a rock shelter. Then all bets are off and you can get intact gourds and everything else in there. But these wet areas are where a lot of the interesting things are going to start popping up in the next decade. There's a bunch of people who've been working in the Caribbean and some of the cenotes in Mesoamerica. And some of them were clearly used as sacrificial areas where literally, perhaps crudely put, the vestal virgins were tossed off the cliff to propitiate the gods. But they were also losing and throwing all sorts of other stuff in there. This is gourd material. There's some other cucurbitacea calabash gourds in here, wicker work, all sorts of basketry. Again, this was stock and standard for the New World and the Old World, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But we've kind of forgotten about it. But if you go back and actually read some of the early accounts in Borneo and Highland New Guinea and Australia, you can really get a much clearer picture of the diversity of stuff that people have. But when you bury all that stuff in a typical terrestrial site, 50 years and it's gone. And there's some interesting crania in Central America. Some of these are in some of these wet sites with dates of 9,000 years. So wet is good. England, some of the earliest real appreciation for wet site materials was in Western Europe and England, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands. This is the remains of a trackway across the marsh. Not a bad reconstruction of what was going on. Some of this is pre-agriculture, some of it is post-agriculture, but if you tried to walk 10 kilometers across some of these big marshes, you'd bog up in about 50 feet. And so people invested the effort to build these trackways. And again, when you see and excavate around these things, there's a lot of stuff that was lost accidentally. Bowls, pots, wood, spoons, hooks, you name it. So it's a real treasure trove. Some of these literally go back for 15 and 20 kilometers. They're not small constructions. They're really massive and clearly tell you a lot about community activity, community organization. And some of these trackways, because they've got good preservation, you can date multiple stakes all the way along. And some of them last for 2,000 and 3,000 years because the dates are wildly different depending on precisely where you are. Never have seen anything like a trackway in the New World, and certainly not in Florida. We are unquestionably losing a lot of archaeological sites in general because of climate change, changes in sea level, changes in lake levels, intentional dewatering of Florida. What do we have, 35 million acres of marshland, or maybe it was more than that from the earlier conversation. This is a little island that is getting eroded off of Cedar Key. Shell-midden organics in here, and they're only working at low tide. So they put a little cofferdam around it, and there's a bunch of burials coming out of this. So we know that some of these places are going to be what I would describe as treasure troves of information that we're losing. This is back up at Puget Sound at low tide. They're working here, and this is about 60 feet away, just back up into this little peninsula. Saturated settlements, again, all sorts of bone, antler, wood, fiber, fabric materials. So when the water rises, they run back in. And when they look at the stuff that's out here, it looks like these guys were actually farming oysters. They were throwing hard debris, flake debris, old oyster shells out in the shallow water and creating what amounts to an oyster farm. Here are some hats and things that come out of Ozette and Hoko. If you were the big muckety-muck and maybe a boat captain, you got to have a wicker hat that had a top knot on it. So when you walked into the community, and this is going back at least 7,000 years, you knew who the big cheese was because he was the one with the top knot on his hat. You could tell instantly who were the paddlers in the boat. Freysack in Germany is an inland site along a marsh area. Excavation started turning up some wells that had been dug into the water, and there was all sorts of stuff inside those wells with dates of about 11,000 BP. Here's a net fragments here. Moose, you can't quite see it in this photo, but this is a moose carving, and more wood, shell, fiber, rope materials literally sort of coming out of the muck. I mean, some of this European material is really mind-boggling. There was a longer period of occupation in Japan in the old world, and a lot of the occupations were down in low areas along rivers that we have dewatered even thousands of years ago. And so some of these sites are still protected, but a lot of them are getting exposed in the last decade or so. Several of us had a chance to work out at Cape Canaveral. When we saw the aerials and some of the early maps, we thought, well, you got a pond out here. Could that have been a perennial pond that went back thousands and thousands of years? We did a number of geoprobe studies out there, did some good dates. This is what it looks like today. This is the skid pad for one of the launches, and these are all launch pads. Nothing out there is older than 6,000 years. Everything on Cape Canaveral has been built up in the relatively recent past. So if you had been at Wendover at this time period, you would have had to go further out to get to the salt water. And anything on the Cape has just been turned and churned over thousands of years. We did a split sample radiocarbon of some shell material, more than anything just for fun. Some of the dark shell came out at, I think it was 30,000, and the white shell came out at about 3,000. All in the same strata. It's 1.5 foot thick stuff. So it's been churned. If there's anything old out there, it's got to have been reworked in the coastal sediments and then kicked up on shore. This is actually the photo that they used out there in the front. It was interesting working on Cape Canaveral. Tom has a group of people who, after every big storm, go out on the beach and monitor what's coming up. They didn't keep really good records of all the rocket launches in the 40s and the 50s, and they were blowing crap up right and left. And then we go, well, that didn't work, let's try this. So he told us, he said, watch for any rocket parts. And every time there's a big storm, there's rocket parts and other miscellaneous stuff that comes up onto the shore area. In England, they have what are called mudlarks that go and look at low tide after every big storm, and they've gotten some prints that go back probably 50 to 60,000 years, human footprints across the mudflat, lots of archaeological material all the way to Roman times and well beyond. And it's the realization that this stuff moves around, and because it's wet, it comes up onto shore during some of these big storms. I suggested at one of the past meetings that maybe we ought to have what we call stormtroopers, bad choice of words, I know, to go out and just look at the coastline and see what's being washed up, eroded in some cases, and in other cases, tossed back up on the beach by these big storms. This is a little place in Bird Island in Dixie County, and this little island, where's my pointer, is eroding after every big storm, and we've got burials out there at about 4,500 BP. There's ceramics on top, non-ceramic materials down on the bottom. Not as good a preservation at Wendover, but nonetheless, it's a good, interesting sample for comparative purposes. Downtown Tokyo. There are no sites in downtown New York, Tokyo. That's a crock. When you're in the low ground, and even though you've built intensively in the last 100 years, there's still an incredible volume of material beneath that surface. And this is part of that downtown excavation. The shogun called up some samurai in the early days. This is probably about 1,000 years old, and said, "Gentlemen, we need water control. And you have been charged with going to the edge of the marsh, building wicker works out here, and controlling water flow and putting in rice paddies." So this is what's going on. And this is, again, this is in downtown Tokyo. This was an 11-hectare open excavation. It was the most massive open excavation I have ever seen. Probably about 70 people working out there. They built a 3-story building to process the materials for lab work. Wood material out the wazoo. Hundreds of thousands of people or pieces of wood from these kinds of things. Everything from bows to shovels that would have been used to, plant the rice and other materials. Looks like a little hoe that, your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather would have been dragging, to put in the furrows. If you were a relatively poor person, you could not have a metal sword, or you would be executed on the spot by the samurai. But you could have these wooden swords, which I think probably would be not quite as deadly, but they would really get your attention on a dark alley in downtown Tokyo. One of the things that amazed me about the Nara and Japanese excavations was the concern and attention for conservation and the incredibly world-class museums that are scattered across the country. We sample, right? We do shovel tests, we do one-by-ones. When they do excavation, they pretty much do 100% excavation. And we asked one of the guys who was our guide and assistant, this is in Lake Biwa, it's a port area. This is about the size of a football field. This has been well pointed, dewatered, and it's about 3 meters below the water table. And there's a smaller one here. This gives you a little better picture of the size of these excavations. And some of this material goes back to 10,000 years. Still nuts in the basket, pottery, wicker work, you name it. It's all there. It's just a matter of getting it out. This is a very small but really nicely outfitted lab to process literally the tons of samples they take from some of these sites. It was really like a factory setting. One of the steps in conservation for a lot of organic material, whether it's bone, antler, wood, doesn't make any difference, is freeze drying. And this is what I thought was the world's largest freeze dryer. All the floor under here pops up, and you've got stainless steel tanks. So this whole thing is filled particularly with wooden material. It's like nothing I have ever seen until I went to Nara. This is maybe the world's largest freeze dryer. This is a walk-in or drive-in freeze dryer. You could drive a Volkswagen van into this thing, close the door, and process it. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, their care, their attention, and devotion. When we asked Kira, and it was a wet site conference a number of years ago, and he was showing pictures of Lake Biwa that you saw a minute ago, and I asked him after we were sitting with a couple of beers, and I said, what's the funding for the analysis of all this material? And we're talking tons. He says, we just turned in the budget for 20 years worth of conservation and analysis. They would have taken me to Chattahoochee if I had suggested, yeah, we need 20 years worth of analysis on this material. This is a big wooden sled made out of probably walnut that they would have hauled, big construction blocks on. It's amazing the material that's coming out of these things. A couple of years ago, I also had a chance to go up into the Beartooth Range in Wyoming or Montana, and you started to see things in the press in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly from Canada, where people were finding things in these little melting ice patches. And this is the business end of an atlatl shaft, or the foreshaft of it, with the intact biface at the business end of it, out of an ice patch about 4,600 years old. So people have started looking in lots of places for these things. In the Sierras in California, a guy, lucky for us, not so lucky for him, posted pictures of materials he was finding in the Sierra Mountain ice packs as they melted. This is about a 3-meter spear. Posted it on Facebook. Somebody looked at it and said, that's state property or federal property up in there. This is not some place you ought to be out collecting artifacts. Ultimately led to his arrest. He had about 30,000 things in his collection. So he was a serious collector, and we've got some problems with serious collectors in Florida as well. There's a small group out of Yellowstone and in Wyoming and Montana who are building a model of where these ice patches are. You go back into the earliest photographs you have, you can see there's some there, and some of them disappear in the last 30 years. And they like Google Earth really good for these things. And this is about the time of year where they had maximum melt, and they can go into some of these places and see what's eroding out of this. This is at about 11,000 feet, and this is all melting back. And some of these, because they got organic materials in them, they can tell you maybe 4,000 years. Some of the materials closer to 8,000 in some cases. It's more scarce. And this is a weird one, a pile of rocks. And there's actually two kind of piles right in here. Some of these may be rock blinds for moving game toward hunters. So there's some strange things up in this high country. And people in Finland are seeing the same thing when they're hunting caribou, that they're controlling population movements to take them to ambush points. So there's a lot of these up into Canada and the northern Rockies. And in some of them, you just walk up, you look down, there's buffalo, there's mountain goat, there's wood materials, and I don't know what bison would be doing at 11,000 feet, but they're there. You know, nobody carried them there. Now, if you want to go back further in some of these wet, frozen deposits, we've got mammoth, mastodon, ox, you know, bison antiquus. They're all over the Siberian plains in Alaska, Canada, and we usually can get pretty good dates on them. There's a couple of things that have come out in the last couple of years from Siberia, one of which was a young wolf, and another one was a young fox. Essentially like you left them in your freezer. Pretty good for 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 in some cases. We know a lot about people who are often intentionally placed in some of these European peat bogs. There was a publication back in the 30s that went through, this is one of those really weird stories. He went through and identified something like 250 bog bodies that had been found in Western Europe, you know, Netherlands, Germany, France, Belgium, you know, Ireland. And a couple of years ago, one of the researchers at University College Dublin, I think is where he was, he started going back through there and says, okay, this is, you know, bog body X. It's supposed to have been reported in 1870, mentioned in the newspaper, and it's supposed to be at Museum X. He started tracking them back, and about 40% of them were pure BS. Nothing was found. He made it up. Clearly, though, there are people like the Tolland man and some of the other materials that are legit, but this guy was just fabricating out the wazoo. Well, you don't find really old, wet materials. That would be the first response that some people would say, except if you go to Gesher Benoit Yaakov in Israel along a little tiny nasty creek that's actually the River Jordan. There's 800,000-year-old wet sediments, and they've got bone. This is a proboscidean skull, had the back end bashed in. They were getting the brain out. There's sticks, there's nuts, there's some leaves in there, environmental data, quite spectacular. And because of the tectonic movement, this is completely lifted, and you're excavating sideways. This is the top of the deposit, and notice that we've got lots of water in here. So it's interesting. One of the most famous of the, not really bog bodies, but the glacial ice pack people is, of course, Ötzi from, depending on who you talk to, it's either Swiss Alps or it's Italian Alps. There's a little bit of an argument about that. Now, if you target only those oldest glaciers and ice pack areas that are melting, I'm going to tell you somewhere in the next 50 years, we're going to find some poor Neanderthal who stepped off the crevasse, and he's waiting to be found. So I may be the only person who thinks this global melting might be a good thing for archaeology. Because he's there. He's going to be there. I guarantee you. It's just a matter of what happens when we find him. And, I mean, it really is an interesting double-edged sword. But these changes are exposing lots of material. And I started this with how important it is to work with the public and how lucky we have been to have such a great, they're not really avocational archaeologists anymore. They're our colleagues who don't get paid to do this work. And we could not do it without them, and I am eternally grateful for those people. We need public support. We need to do what we can in terms of public education and involve the public in these things. And about 4 years ago, I guess now, there was another phone call made to Department of State and said, off the coast, there's some sport divers who are bringing back some shark's teeth, like Jim was talking about in his early life. He says, they're also bringing back human skeletal material. And he felt, that didn't seem quite right, you know, and there are certainly laws that say that is also not quite right. And Ryan Duggins is right there in the middle of this. I think he's actually in the field. And it's basically another Wendover, about, 200 meters off the coast and about 20 feet of water. And it's had a lot of erosion problems, but you can still see the wood, you can see the stakes, you can see the burials, and the dates are really, really close to Wendover. So, you know, these guys may have known each other, so to speak. I haven't heard whether they've had any better luck with the DNA than we have. The DNA part's been a frustration, but we really do, owe a debt of gratitude to the people who take the time to call and say, hey, guess what I have found? And if it wasn't for them, we would be far, far less lucky than we have been in Florida. So thank you. And I think we